Welcome to another webinar sponsored by the Southeast Asia program at Stanford University. My name is Don Emerson. I'm on the program. I'm delighted that we have a good turnout and we have a terrific topic, an excellent topic, and we have two superb speakers and authors to discuss the topic. The featured presentation is linked to a book manuscript that is now in the making at Stanford University. Thanks to the presence and hard work of Ambassador Scot Marciel. I will introduce him first. Scot Marciel is a visiting scholar and practitioner fellow in the Southeast Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford. And the webinar, as I've just said, will feature ideas and reflections drawn from his book manuscript in progress, provisionally entitled Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. And that's, of course, the title of our webinar. Ambassador Marciel is a career U.S. Foreign Service officer. He served as America's ambassador to Myanmar in 2016-2020 at a particularly challenging time for U.S.-Myanmar relations, not to mention, of course, the situation there today following the recent coup. Earlier assignments included tours as ambassador to Indonesia, ambassador for ASEAN affairs, principal deputy assistant secretary of state for East Asian and Pacific affairs, and I could go on. Ambassador Marciel has had more than 35 years of experience as a diplomat in Asia and around the world, including assignments in Vietnam, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. Our second speaker is Catharin Dalpino. She is Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. So you can see the connection here, foreign service, right? Policy. In addition to commenting on Ambassador Marciel's presentation, Professor Dalpino will share reflections and ideas drawn from a recently issued Asia Foundation report that she co-edited and co-wrote, entitled Problems and Urgent Issues in U.S. Southeast Asian Relations for 2021. At Georgetown, Professor Dalpino taught Southeast Asian Studies and led the university's Thai Studies program. The many other institutions in which she has lectured, researched, administered, or advised include the Asia Foundation, the Aspen Institute, and the Brookings Institution. She was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and has held positions at the World Bank and at the United Nations in Geneva. She is the author of articles and books on U.S.-Asian relations and has testified on that topic many times before the Senate and the House of Representatives.
I'm often told by my Southeast Asia friends that we don't really understand Southeast Asia and that we struggle to engage with it both consistently and effectively. Probably those are some fair points. I think one of the challenges of understanding Southeast Asia is because its nations are so diverse. And Don and Catherine know this very well. You can be quite knowledgeable about Vietnam or Malaysia. That doesn't necessarily make you an expert on Thailand or Philippines. And so the expertise, such as it is, tends to be kind of divided up. And then you don't have the breadth and depth, present company excluded, of scholarship and books and so on the region, on individual countries that you do if you're going to, say, China or Korea or so on. So there's an overall less expertise. The other factors that come into play in terms of U.S. engagement is, I'd say, one, Southeast Asian countries, with the exception probably of Vietnam and Singapore, they don't really work Washington particularly well, whether it's lack of skill or lack of a desire to do so. And Washington is a place that you have to work as a foreign government to get its attention, unless you're in crisis all the time. And so that's something that's largely been missing. So those factors, plus, again, the absence of a dominant player or a dominant institution with which Washington can easily engage, tends to mean that Southeast Asia will sometimes get less attention than it otherwise might. And Asia policymakers will tend to focus, naturally enough, on the big countries, the Chinas, the Japans, Koreas, Australia, et cetera, and a little bit less on Southeast Asia. So you've had on occasion the tendency to see Southeast Asia as a bit of a sideshow. Now, this wasn't always the case. During the Vietnam War, obviously, the U.S. was heavily engaged and heavily invested in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Philippines, all those places. Now, you can say we weren't particularly wisely invested, but nonetheless heavily invested. With the end of the Vietnam War, certainly with the end of the Cold War, the U.S. lost the strategic prism through which it previously had looked at the region. It's understandable. The Soviet Union had collapsed. People were looking at German unification and so many other issues. But there was no longer really a strategic prism through which policymakers. And so beginning around 1990, 1991, for at least the next 20 years, policymakers, myself included, tended to focus on Southeast Asia more as, how can we promote democracy and human rights or advance our trade and commercial agenda? There wasn't as much of a strategic focus. And what that meant is that you had, because of the lack of strategic emphasis, episodic engagement, questions about the purpose of the alliances, particularly with the Philippines and Thailand. And you had a tendency in Washington to calibrate the relationships to a certain extent based on our assessment of the progress or lack thereof on human rights and democracy. Now, the Obama administration did step up engagement beginning in 2009 after the George W. Bush administration had been seen, at least in the region, as neglecting the region, focused on mostly the Middle East, Afghanistan, et cetera. So the Obama administration did ramp up, did engage a lot more. There was some criticism in the region that perhaps that was more rhetoric than reality, but there was a lot more attention paid to the region. Then more recently under the Trump administration, you had less of that with President Trump withdrawing from TPP, which was very significant, but also frankly not showing up at the ASEAN summits regularly. And those showing up at those summits is pretty fundamental to showing the region that your commitment is genuine. Now, in recent years, including under the Trump administration, the rise of China has re-injected the strategic element back into the U.S. view of Southeast Asia, and so caused to some extent more attention to be paid. But I would argue there's been some problems in the way that it's done. But before I jump into that, let me just give a couple of specific examples about the ups and downs over the years. Thailand, I think, is a really good example of relationship of Thailand, of what I'm talking about since the end of the Vietnam War and the Cold War. The Vietnam War was arguably the zenith of the relationship of the alliance with Thailand. It was quite close, if not perfect. And even after the Vietnam War, cooperation on working on the Cambodia issue and so on kept us reasonably close. But with the end of the Cold War, from a Thai perspective, the U.S. kind of started treating Thailand like it treated everybody else, pushing on trade issues and human rights issues, and they sort of felt a sense of an absence of that special, what's special about this alliance. And I think a lot of people have argued that the alliance has been somewhat adrift since then. And then if you look at the Thai political problems over the last 15 years, including 2 coups and the strong US reaction to those 2 coups, that didn't cause the drift, but I would say it's exacerbated it. So Thailand is a really important relationship, and there's still a lot of reservoirs of goodwill and networks of relationships and a lot of areas of cooperation. But it's clearly a relationship that on both sides, I think, has disappointed to some extent. Vietnam is kind of an example the other way. It's almost the example that proves the case, in that since the early 1990s, we've had a pretty steady positive trajectory in the relationship. Normalization, obviously, in 1995, a bilateral trade agreement, a steady flow of high-level visits back and forth, broadening and deepening of the relationship very consistently. Now, there have been issues. Human rights, certainly first among them, religious freedom, and for the Vietnamese, some concerns about some of the activities of particular Vietnamese American groups. But both governments, I would say, have done a good job of not letting those issues define the relationship or stop us from building the relationship. The dialogue at a high level has continued consistently, And I think it's a really, I can't say it's a model because Vietnam is unique in so many ways, but some interesting things to learn from how we've managed the problems and challenges in that relationship. And last, Indonesia. The U.S. certainly paid a lot of attention to Indonesia during the reform period that followed Suharto and afterwards, partly because of hope for democracy, partly out of fear that Indonesia might fall apart, and then, of course, the serious terrorism concerns. And under President Obama, we had both a comprehensive partnership announced and then a strategic partnership. But I think the general sense is the relationship is still somewhat underperformed over the last 20 or 30 years. And part of the reason is the commercial relationship, trade and investment is still kind of very much underperforming compared to, say, Vietnam or Thailand or elsewhere. There's also concerns on the part of the Indonesians, their long history of non-aligned movement, a wariness of getting too close to any big power, and also concerns about US policy in the Middle East and attitudes toward Islam. These things have combined to I wouldn't say cause disappointment, but maybe allow the relationship to underperform to some extent. As I mentioned, I'll close with this on China. The China's rise has certainly injected the strategic element back into the Washington viewpoint, but I would argue, at least under the last administration, it's too soon to say in the current one, there was a tendency to approach Southeast Asia through the prism of US-China policy, rather than Southeast Asia on its own merits. And there was also an occasional lack of understanding that, with possible exception of, say, Vietnam and the Philippines, much of Southeast Asia didn't view China as a threat the way we did, and certainly viewed it as much more of a partner than perhaps we did. There was a tendency to maybe judge ASEAN largely on its ability or lack thereof to push back on Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And of course, importantly, as I mentioned earlier, the president didn't make it to the last few ASEAN summits, which never goes over well, and raised more questions about US commitment. And lastly, there wasn't really a very well thought out trade and investment element of the strategy to Southeast Asia, which is essential given how important economics are. So overall, the conclusion is that the partnership, US partnership or series of partnerships with Southeast Asia have underperformed and disappointed to some extent. I don't want to exaggerate it. There's been a lot of benefits from the relationship to both sides, and a lot of good relationships, a lot of good cooperation, but still it's somewhat underperformed, somewhat disappointed. And so the question going forward, given the importance and growing importance of Southeast Asia and given the rise of China, is what can be done to try to improve the partnership in the 5, 10, 20 years going forward. I'll stop there.
I, like Scott, am a dedicated Southeast Asianist, have been literally all my life, for as long as I could remember, because I partly grew up there. And I want to review some of the paradigms that Southeast Asianists hold dear and hope that they can interest the policy community in, all of which Scott has articulated and which I have oftentimes articulated too, because I think it would be good as we look at a new administration and perhaps a new era in U.S. Southeast Asian relations to test some of these. And the first paradigm is that we used to pay a lot of attention to Southeast Asia and we don't anymore. And that is certainly true. I mean, obviously we could not have paid more attention to Southeast Asia than we did in the Vietnam War. And in retrospect, perhaps we paid too much attention at times. But I don't think we all have always paid enough attention to the way we were perceived at that time and how that legacy, those perceptions carry over. Because one of the persistent problems that we have had with Southeast Asia, and we will continue to have, is asymmetry. And where you have a very large and very powerful country in alliances with smaller countries. And the question of reliability and whether the United States can be relied upon goes all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. And I'm not sure it has ever really stopped. It has just changed forms in many ways. As I have done a lot of work on Thailand, even in what we think of as the glory days of the U.S.-Thailand alliance in the late 1960s, when we had 9 joint bases and tens of thousands of advisors. The Thais had good reason, in their view, to sometimes doubt if we would still be there when they needed us. And also, I think if you ask former President Nguyen Van Thu, who is no longer living, from South Vietnam, if we turned out to be a very reliable ally or not, he might dissent from that. And I don't mean to be overly critical of the United States, but we do share different geographic positions. We do share different places on the power structure. And so I don't think that we want to romanticize that time when we did pay a tremendous amount of attention to Southeast Asia. And I think we want to keep in mind that that kind of distrust or fear that the United States is always going to be distracted in its relations with Southeast Asia is probably permanent. Second is, I too believe that the United States needs more engagement in Southeast Asia. I worry, however, and this certainly became a problem in doing the latest report with recommendations to the new administration, is that many of us as Southeast Asians tend to look at engagement as a silver bullet. If only we engaged more with Southeast Asians, we would get X, Y, or Z. Engagement will get us perhaps a more sympathetic hearing, but it will not necessarily deliver to us the interest that we are seeking. And I think that we need to be clear within ourselves and sometimes with our Southeast Asian interlocutors about how those interests can diverge and how they perhaps can be better understood and worked out through engagement. But we're about to find this out with Myanmar. And once again, the United States will press ASEAN to take a certain road. And once again, for various reasons, ASEAN will resist in some ways. And that's already beginning to happen, we can see. Another thing that I want to talk about is U.S. China rivalry. And I agree that we should not put Southeast Asia in between the United States and China. On the other hand, we have this problem, which is that China wants to put Southeast Asia in between the United States and China. And on occasion, some Southeast Asian countries will sometimes play these two powers off against one another. But here's the problem, is that if we want to sell Southeast Asia to the power structure in Washington as being more important, we're going to have to play the China card to some extent. This is a new strategic rationale, if you like, and how we can square that circle, how we can, as Scott rightly says, recognize Southeast Asia for its own value and still fulfill that strategic purpose is going to take diplomacy. It's going to take very skilled defense diplomacy as well. It's going to take a number of things. But I don't think we can simply say that U.S.-China rivalry does not count in U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. I think it certainly does. Now, in the second half, I will talk about more specific recommendations and hopefully we'll key with those. There's a lot of commonality that we found that has also been seen in Scott's manuscript as well. So I'll look forward to that part of the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. So Scott, what do you think? How would you respond to those 3 issues that are concepts, notions, suggestions?
No, Catherine makes really good points, absolutely, including the point that just showing up isn't a panacea, although I would argue it's essential. It's necessary, but not sufficient. I want to highlight the last point that Catherine made on the U.S.-China thing, and this is, I've been struggling to come up with a thesis statement, if you will, for this book all along, but if I had to boil it down, it's that for us, there's a difference between being aware of the China factor, very aware of the China factor in our policy towards Southeast Asia, and making our policy or our engagement with Southeast Asia all about China. And my argument has been for a long time that China's there, as Southeast Asians will tell us. China's there, it's going to be there, it's going to be influential, it's going to do what it can to exert its influence and increase its influence. The Southeast Asians, for the most part, see that. They have agency in this. They don't want to be dominated by China any more than they want to be dominated by us or anybody else. And that really the key for us is to bring our A game to Southeast Asia. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But bringing our A game to policy in Southeast Asia, to engagement in Southeast Asia, means being there as a consistent, reliable partner. And reliable, as per Catharine's point, doesn't necessarily mean agreeing always. But we're there, we're consistent, they know we're going to be there, and as much as we can demonstrate that. And being a good partner and being a reliable partner for Southeast Asia based on shared interests that we have with Southeast Asia, and I'll get into some of the areas in a minute, that's the best way to advance our interest, and I think most of Southeast Asia's interest, in giving them as much freedom of maneuver as possible vis-a-vis China. In other words, rather than going there and talking to them about why China's a problem and they should be tougher on China, that's not very helpful. It's much more useful to build an actually good, strong partnership with the different countries in Southeast Asia and with ASEAN. That by itself, not an anti-China policy at all, that by itself, that good relationship gives them maneuvering room. And it's not just us, of course, the same could be said for Japan, Korea, Australia, and many others. So I think that's the key, is not making it all about China. But that doesn't mean that we're not very aware of China and the impact of our policy on the relationship between Southeast Asia and China. So what does it mean to bring the A game? Obviously showing up, starting at the presidential level. Per Catharine's point, showing up doesn't mean agreement or even understanding, but it's sort of over time, 3 or 4 or 5 years in a row, the president shows up and our ambassadors are in place and all these things. It begins to build, at least temporarily, some confidence in the region that we're serious. That itself is essential. Second, consistent engagement. Being there, dialogue, etc. And this is really tricky in the context of the latest developments in Myanmar, because in the book I argue that we need to find a way that even when there's problems on democracy and human rights, we don't pull back dramatically. Obviously, we're not going to do business as usual. And I look at the 2014 Thai coup. There's no way we're going to do business as usual in the sense of pretend it didn't happen. We are the United States, we always stand for democracy and what have you. But sometimes we've gotten in a bit of a default mode in Washington, I think, where when something bad happens, we pull back. Some things pulling back may make some sense, but it is important generally to keep the conversation going on, keep the dialogue going. Otherwise, you have no influence. And it's tricky. It's a hard sell in Washington, frankly. Now, after I wrote that, Myanmar generals carried out their coup. And I found myself asking, well, geez, should we engage with these guys? I don't want to say too much about this because having just left as ambassador to Myanmar, I want to be careful about offering policy prescriptions when my successor is in place. But there's a big difference, I think, in this situation. And I would just point to David Matheson's very good article in The Nation last week, in which he called the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, the army of darkness. It's not a group that you can easily have a good dialogue and useful, productive dialogue with. So I would say, my argument that we should try to continue to engage as much as possible is a general argument. I'm not sure it applies in this particular case. Money. Even during the Obama rebalance, we didn't really increase the amount of assistance to Southeast Asia. I don't want to overstate that assistance buys you influence, but it helps. It's important. And it also, actually, if it's done well, benefits the people on the ground. We spend about 3% of our total foreign aid budget in Asia, in East Asia, I should say. Most of that, not all of it, most of that goes to Southeast Asia. If we were to shift even 1% more from the rest of the world to Southeast Asia, it would be a 25% increase in our total assistance to the region. And I have some ideas on how we could use it. And that gets to the next point, which is showing up is important, engaging is important, but you've got to have an agenda, and it's got to be a positive agenda. It's got to start with trade and the economy. hugely important anywhere. We pulled out of TPP. I would defer to the trade experts on what we do, but we need to have a trade policy, a trade initiative going forward. Most of the people I've talked to rejoining CPTPP right now may be a bit of a stretch for us domestically, but some have argued that there may be smaller, more discrete trade agreements that could be negotiated either with all of ASEAN or with key partners. And I think it's really important to get in there and do that. Plus to try to continue to push on investment, particularly in infrastructure, a challenge for us and for US companies. But using the BUILD Act, working in partnership with the Japanese and others, we need to keep trying to do more on that front. Second, in the areas of what I would call non-traditional security, health. We do a lot. We've spent $3.5 on health in Southeast Asia since 2001, 2002. It's a really good partnership. There's two problems. One, nobody knows about it. So we've got to do a much better job of getting that message out to the publics. Two, obviously our handling of COVID, and I'm certainly no expert here, but I think it's fair to say it has been less than ideal. So that puts us in a difficult situation, but I have to believe going forward that as we ramp up vaccine production and take care of our own people, that there's opportunities to work more with Southeast Asia, but also perhaps to do some lessons learned with Southeast Asia, in which we acknowledge our own failings and weaknesses in dealing with this. But there could easily be another pandemic. And so we can do a really good lessons learned work. Climate change, hugely important. Many of the countries in Southeast Asia are particularly vulnerable to climate change. We should be working with them more on that. And I would argue on water. Water, we're doing a lot in the South China Sea, on the Mekong, and some other, in terms of fisheries and so on. We ought to pull them together in one big water initiative. We need to continue investing in youth. The next generation, I have high hopes for in the region through our YSEALI program, a scholarship, an ASEAN scholarship program, these sorts of things. The Mekong is hugely important. There's already been some good work done, the State Department funding new programs to shed light and offer transparency. And the more we can internationalize that issue, the better. And China and Chinese dams are a huge issue, but they're not the only issue. So this is a huge area to work on. And it's an area, going back to Thailand, where I think we can work more with the Thai. And I think one of the ways to revitalize the alliance with the Thai is to work with them on these regional things. We're already doing it to some extent. We could do more. And I don't mean anti-China things. I mean just things like working on the Mekong, working on health, where we already have good cooperation, and certainly climate change. There's a lot more I could get into, but I'll stop by saying that the initial signs from the new administration are of pretty active engagement with Southeast Asia, which I think is positive. The key is to make it last.
I have a couple of questions. Let me pose the first one. This is from the audience. Alex Arifianto from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore has a question for Ambassador Marciel and also one for Professor Dalpino. For Scott, the question is, do you see ASEAN continuing to play a major role within the next 10 years or so? Alternatively, could it be superseded and replaced by new regional institutions that are likely to be closely affiliated or sponsored by either China or the United States?
Don, you probably are a better place to answer that than I am, but I'll give it a shot. I think ASEAN is still a pretty important institution for Southeast Asia. It has its limitations, as Don mentioned earlier, and of which we're very aware, and people in Southeast Asia are very aware, but I think it's still essential. No, I mean, it's always dangerous to make predictions, but I would be surprised to see it replaced or superseded by institutions aligned with either the US or China. For the simple reason that the whole reason that ASEAN was created and has existed all along was to kind of make sure that the South regions could have a voice of their own and not have the big powers come in and speak for them. So I think that's pretty deep in the DNA of most of Southeast Asia.
Right. I mean, of course, there is another possibility here, not that there would be new institutions sponsored respectively by either Beijing or Washington. I mean, depending upon how bad the quote unquote so-called, but probably inaccurately called Cold War between the two countries, but rather the possibility of minilateralism inside Southeast Asia and overlapping multilateralism in and outside of Southeast Asia. And I think the example of the CPTPP illustrates how, in that case, you have a certain number of Southeast Asian countries that are involved, together with a number of countries outside Southeast Asia, but it doesn't cleave to an ASEAN mold. And I think possibilities there. Now, probably one of the most extreme speculations, which at this point seems to me highly, highly unlikely, but we're talking 5, 10 years down the road. If the Quad were to develop into something worth talking about, not just perhaps on the security side, but maybe even on other matters, including economic questions, and keeping in mind that the democratic character of the Quad is seriously called into doubt by developments, for example, recently in Modi's version of democracy in India. I mean, a lot of problematic questions there, but it is conceivable to imagine a Quad plus, in which the plus might involve one or more, maybe Singapore and other possible countries in Southeast Asia. So that's how my comment there. Now, the question, if I may, for Catharin also, and since Alex is watching, thank you very much, Alex. These are excellent questions. Okay, here's the question for Catharin. The US academic expertise on Southeast Asia has been in continuous decline since the end of the Vietnam War and the end of the Cold War, with many senior faculty with Southeast Asia expertise not being replaced by junior scholars when they retire. What do you think needs to be done to reverse these trends? Do you think the establishment of Japan and Korea foundations, which provide endowed professorships and research grants to support new generations of scholars, should that model be considered in order to rejuvenate Southeast Asian studies in the US? Presumably, Alex is suggesting the birth of a Southeast Asia Foundation that would play that kind of role. What do you think?
I think it's an excellent question. First of all, I agree. I mean, one of the ironies of the way that Asian studies are viewed now is that Northeast Asian studies are supreme, but in the 1950s and 60s, Southeast Asian studies, largely which were funded by the US government because of the Vietnam War, were possibly ascendant over Northeast Asian studies in some ways. Let me first point out that Singapore does support a Southeast Asian program at the Brookings Institution, and the Thai government has in the past, when it had the funds, and when it was simpatico with various universities, have supported Thai and Southeast Asian studies programs at American universities. I started one in Georgetown with the Thai government. That was the first ever grant that they made to an American university. There was a learning curve, but they did complete that curve. They also made several grants to universities around the country, more for Thai cultural studies, where our program at Georgetown was more what we would think of as a political economic program. So yes, I think that you could certainly look to some of the larger, more wealthy Southeast Asian countries to do so. I see pockets of very deep interest, though, in my students in Southeast Asia. There is a lot of interest in Vietnam, usually, in part because of the history the United States had with it, in part because of the Vietnamese American community. There's a lot of interest oftentimes in Indonesia. I used to teach at SAIS, which had a language requirement. And we had a lot of people who were Indonesian specialists because they found that learning Bahasa was easier than learning Burmese or Thai or Vietnamese. So I think, if you follow those interests as well, you could do that. But I think that the point of your question, which is turning to those Southeast Asian countries and saying, we really do need your help in stimulating Southeast Asian programs in the United States when we're past the COVID recession and things like that, would be very good, because it's so clearly enlightened self-interest on their part that I think that we probably might be able to see some success in that.
Yeah, good. Now, let me move on to another question from the audience. A gentleman from the Center of Governance and Political Studies in Malaysia says the following question is for both speakers. what does the recent signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which excludes the US but includes China, mean for the US ASEAN relationship? Or perhaps put more broadly, for the US Southeast Asia relationship? Either one can answer, and starting, it's up to you, either Scott or Catherine.
Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it means much for the US ASEAN relationship at all. And I certainly haven't heard much on this side about very much alarm on it. First, the RCEP is what, as everybody knows, the Status Quo Agreement. And so it does standardize some things, but there were no great leaps in that agreement, breaking trade barriers and things like that. Pretty much everybody that signed that agreement was already in some kind of an FTA with the other, number one. And who did they not get? They did not get India. That was a really, really big missed opportunity. I was probably never a possibility that the United States was going to seriously join RCEP. So yes, I mean, it will probably, particularly in the short term, with the conditions that COVID has put upon the global economy, strengthen some of China's advantages in Southeast Asia. But it just is not that forward-looking trade agreement that we would have had with TPP had the United States stayed in it, that not only would give them access through an FTA to a larger market that they have not enjoyed to that extent before, be it the United States or India, but also doesn't much raise the standards. And the TPP would have raised the standards. So we're kind of underwhelmed by RCEP here in Washington.
Scott?
Thanks. I generally agree with Catherine. I would add one point. I'm not sure it's a disagreement, but just an additional point. I think perception-wise, RCEP matters, perhaps more than substance. And it to me just reinforces what was already the need for the United States to show up in Southeast Asia with a serious trade agenda. Not to counter RCEP, but to counter the perception, particularly since we withdrew from TPP, that the US is not participating in the multilateral trade game in Southeast Asia in terms of new initiatives. But I don't think it's because of RCEP that we need to do that. I think it just highlights once again the importance of having a trade initiative.
I would say this. I agree with Catherine. Her comparison of RCEP with CPTPP, or formerly the TPP, it seems very well taken. But here is a question from the audience, who asks a fundamental question, namely, will Southeast Asia remain relevant for the United States except for China? Is China necessary for the Southeast Asian region to be relevant for the United States? And then the question is also this, and a statement, an opinion. What makes China more favorable in the eyes of Southeast Asian countries is that they're compared with the Americans, they interfere less in domestic problems. Will the Biden administration interfere less in Southeast Asian countries' domestic problems and yet still somehow manage to maintain good relationships with them? That's a huge question. If either one of you would like to take it on.
I'll start, and I'll betray my role as a U.S. diplomat.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think Southeast Asia is important, even if China's not a factor. Obviously, there are some people who will pay less attention to it if China's not there. But I think overall, this 600 million people, sixth largest economy in the world, collectively, yes, it still would be important. Second, not surprisingly, I would take issue with the assumption behind your second question that the U.S. interferes more. I was just in Myanmar for 4 years. Boy, who was interfering in Myanmar domestic affairs? Who was supplying weapons to ethnic armed groups? Right. I mean, I can go on and on, but I won't. I think the U.S. tends to speak out more certainly than China on democracy and human rights. If that's interference, fair enough. I think if you ask the people on the streets of Yangon or Mandalay right now, I think they're pretty favorably disposed to our position on the coup. I realize that's not necessarily the case everywhere. But I just I think we have a pretty good track record for all of our failings, and we've had plenty of failings, of trying to be on the side of supporting people in the countries who are trying to build improved governance, more accountability, fighting corruption, better economic development that benefits a lot of people. I think we overall have a pretty good track record. Again, plenty of failings. And I think our support for democracy and freedom is one of the reasons that there's still a strong reservoir of goodwill for the United States and much of Southeast Asia.
Okay, thanks. Catherine, you want to comment?
Just briefly, I totally agree with Scott on mischaracterizations or assumptions about this. All countries will interfere in the internal affairs of another country if their interests dictate it. And but yes, I mean, I can think of many examples in which China has interfered or attempted to interfere in the internal affairs of another country. One of the things I have found that is interesting is that I think that because there is greater domestic pressure in China, that we're going to see more of that. For example, China never commented on ethnic conflict in Southeast Asia until the last few decades, when they were getting domestic pressure in the late 1990s, when they had the Indonesian reformasi demonstrations and revolution. China actually, for the first time, spoke out publicly about the treatment of ethnic Chinese, in part because a lot of the brutalities against ethnic Chinese were being shown on the television screens of people in households in Beijing. So yeah, I think that we have a lot of apples and oranges, but I would agree with Scott. At whatever point, Don, I'd like to get back to your question about TPP and CPTPP, yes, right, because I think that's a good segue into the recommendations, because this is something that the Asia Foundation Task Force dealt with extensively. We had a lot of members who were former trade officials, and a lot of U.S. Business community was represented too. I think the TPP and the CPTPP are off the table for the United States now, and I don't think they're going to come back. Broad agreements that cover all things under one agreement are becoming less and less fashionable, and there's less and less support for them in Washington. I mean, the NAFTA/USMCA was a very good example, and they're finding particularly that these broad agreements are very hard to reconcile internally. For example, it's hard to reconcile the agricultural part of the agreement with the digital trade part of the agreement. The fashion seems to be more towards more narrow sector-specific agreements, and Scott also mentions this in his manuscript. This is a really nice convergence, and I do believe that the Biden administration will probably take something up that the Trump administration has started, which was discussions about an incremental regional trade agreement with Southeast Asian countries on digital trade, which has not been covered mostly in agreements. And, you know, this would be, you know, we're watching the European Union assemble a regional FTA in Southeast Asia, country by country. And one day people will wake up and there will be an EU ASEAN FTA. It will be the biggest FTA, the richest FTA, and people will wonder how that happened. And this is because it's being negotiated country by country. We do have a digital trade agreement with Singapore, and there is some discussion about adding other countries on. So this would be what we would call plug and play, which is that we wouldn't negotiate it with the entire region or with ASEAN. We would, and those countries that felt that they could and wanted to come in could when they felt they were able. I think that's going to be these more streamlined, more narrow sector-specific trade agreements, I think are going to be the trade agreements of the future.
And how about the Asia Foundation recommendations?
It recommended a regional trade agreement with Southeast Asia. We didn't, you know.
You've got other recommendations.
Oh yeah, the lot. Before I leave trade, let me say that we were rather brutal. I think the first statement in the substance in the report was, we don't have a trade policy, we need a trade policy. That the last 4 years, the United States did not have anything that we could find that we would describe as a trade policy. It was just pressure for countries to lower their trade surpluses with the United States. And so the need to have something, even if it's only bilateral, that can be described as a coherent trade policy with the countries of Southeast Asia is a necessity of first order. Something else that we that I'll highlight, and then I'll yield to Scott for many of his excellent recommendations, was this whole issue of alliances and security partnerships. The United States in Southeast Asia has a menagerie of security relationships, and they don't really line up with each other. If you ask the Pentagon what they think one of the strongest security relationships they have in Southeast Asia is, they would not say Thailand or the Philippines, they would say with Singapore. And we have with Singapore what we call a strategic partnership. At one point, there was evidence that Thailand envied Singapore's strategic partnership. This was in the Thaksin era. And Bangkok suggested that perhaps they could replace the alliance with the strategic partnership because they thought this was actually a higher level. We do have these two Cold War alliances, one of which we're now trying to renegotiate with the Visiting Forces Agreement with the Philippines. And we need to square the circle a little bit more. To sort of see how it is that we're going to have alliances, if we still want to call them alliances. Perhaps we don't want to call them alliances in Southeast Asia. Perhaps we want to call them security partnerships, or have something strategic part, have something that would better suit 21st century security, because the hub and spokes seems still to work fairly well in Northeast Asia. It stopped working in Southeast Asia a long time ago. And yes, certainly sitting down with Thailand and talking about the fate of the alliance is very important, although I think it needs to be very concrete and have some very specific recommendations. But we have very different kinds of security relationships. And I'm not saying that we should apply a cookie cutter formula, but I'm saying that we should look at them, reevaluate them, and reweigh them. And perhaps find a way, out of this, why don't our allies behave in this way, right, and sort of make them, modernize them, bring them up to the 21st century. Right. That was a huge recommendation in the task force.
So Scott, if you could then, following Catherine's lead, if you could perhaps share with us some of the recommendations that you might make in the book, or quite apart from the book. And let me just add a little footnote. At some point before we end the conversation, we probably should talk about the South China Sea. But yeah, what about the recommendations in your manuscript that you might want to share with us?
Yeah, well, I think I covered some of them, but rather quickly because I was running low on time. So beyond the sort of broad, show up and these sorts of things, some specifics. First, on the alliance question, I agree with Catherine. We need to take a look at this. I would say that the Philippines, I don't want to speak for the government in the Philippines, certainly, but there's a real purpose to the alliance, and the fact that Secretary Blinken recently reaffirmed that the alliance applies to any attacks on Philippine forces or vessels or planes in the South China Sea, I think is quite important for the Philippines. So, whether you call it an alliance or not, that the element is important. But I agree, certainly in the case of Thailand, I think the challenge, always hard in Washington and maybe in places like Bangkok too, is to think, where do we want to cooperate? There's already a lot of cooperation, but where else can we expand it? And I think there's lots of opportunities, again, in the Mekong and so on. Then you figure out, okay, what do we want to call it? Do we want to stick to the alliance, or do we want to call it something else? To me, that should be a secondary question. Although obviously, if you move away from an alliance, you have a lot of work to do to reassure people that you're not downgrading. Other specific recommendations. I talked about the trying to shift 1% or even 1.5% of our foreign aid budget from the rest of the world to Southeast Asia. If you did that, one, I'd start an Asean Scholarship program. One of our best assets is our universities. And people want to come to our universities. They get a great education. They also usually return to their home countries to contribute, but also to remain friends of the United States. So I'd like to see us start an Asean Scholarship program. Two, I think one of our other assets is the admiration for our private sector, particularly in entrepreneurship and IT and startups and what have you. I wonder if we couldn't, there's already some work being done with U.S. ASEAN Business Council and other things in this area. I think there's more that could be done. Sitting down with the business community in those sectors and coming up with some ideas. One of them would be to have sort of a subset or a separate YSEALI-like program for would-be entrepreneurs and startup executives in Southeast Asia to play to one of our strengths. Third, I'm jumping around here, Cobra Gold. I think we should stop tinkering with and calibrating Cobra Gold every year to reflect our level of happiness or unhappiness with the state of democracy and human rights in Thailand. We do Cobra Gold because it's the biggest multilateral exercise, certainly in the region. It's in our interest. It's I think we should just stop tinkering with it. Maybe that's going to be too hard to do in Washington, but I think we should just do it. I mentioned briefly the idea of a water initiative. I think there's an opportunity to pull together some things we're already doing, the Mekong, South China Sea, but also in protecting coastal fisheries, water-based tourism, rivers, etc., and try to work a broader water initiative that might cover these things. And the benefit of that is you get some value out of getting people to talk about maybe some commonalities, for example, between South China Sea and the Mekong, although there's huge differences also. So I think that's an opportunity. Clearly, we need to be engaged heavily trying to help countries mitigate and plan for climate change. That's a huge problem already, whether you're talking about the Mekong Delta in Vietnam or the coastal waterways in Myanmar or parts of Indonesia. So I think there's a lot that we can do there. And then per your earlier point about quality versus quantity, I think we should be emphasizing more quality responsible investment. The Trump administration trotted out a handful of programs along these lines. Some of them haven't worked, others may, but I think there's more that can be done there. Because in the end, we need to be able to contribute to an investment and infrastructure in the region to solidify our stance as a good partner.
Good. All right. Okay. On the South China Sea, Catherine, do you have any thoughts?
Can I come back to Scott's point about Thailand and the alliance, though? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I think we need to stop mistaking the alliance with Thailand for our entire relationship with Thailand. And I think we need to sort of compartmentalize it more as this is the military part of the relationship. And I think that would in many ways help us figure out what our core interests and what our common strategic concerns are. So for that reason, I would really not recommend putting Mekong into the US-Thailand alliance, because that implies that we are trying to militarize the Mekong. And we simply we're not positioned to do that. I don't think it would be necessarily helpful. Should we help Thailand with the Mekong and look to them for leadership? Absolutely, but I would like to keep it out of the alliance in that way. I think there are a lot of 21st century things we could think of with respect to reviving the military relationship with Thailand. I would start out, if I were sitting in a room with Thais discussing that, I'd say, how do you feel about China possibly having a naval base in Cambodia at Ream? Because one of the things that we would be talking about is the fact that China is not going to necessarily stop at the South China Sea. And this hooks back to your point, Don, but also there are things that could be done in a concrete way. For the past 20 years, the United States and Thailand have been bouncing back and forth like a ball, the idea of cooperating to turn Utapao, the naval base in Upper South, into a regional hub for disaster assistance and humanitarian response. And perfect, that's what the United States used in the 2004 tsunami. They actually put boots back on the ground in Utapao for a month. And institutionalizing that when the time is right, I think would go very far towards putting the United States and Thailand on slightly new footing. I mean, there are a lot of things that we could do, but I think it's necessary going into the 21st century not to confuse the alliance with the entire relationship, because that really is no longer the case. And that has been part of the problem after the Vietnam War. In terms of the South China Sea, I'm going to crib from one of our members in the task force, Greg Pauling, who said, yes, the United States is always going to have freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. There's no question of that, but will Southeast Asian countries always have it? And here, how it is that we are going to support and help Southeast Asian countries to protect their territorial rights, their fishing rights in the South China Sea, I think is, a very difficult question. Simply sticking up for international law is not going to do it, because I don't think those disputes are ever going to be settled through international law. I think that ship has sailed, pardon the pun. And, but here again, we get back to my original point about asymmetry. And I think one of the things that makes Southeast Asians nervous about partnering with the United States on the South China Sea is that our navigational rights are not really at issue here. Theirs are. And there is a difference. So,
in the time remaining, but let me just introduce two things. And there may be items that you would like to discuss, in which case ignore my two things and say what you want to say. But the two things are these. One is rather abstract, the other is very specific. The abstract is this. Is it in our interest to have circulating in Southeast Asia from one foreign ministry to another, particularly in Singapore, but in a number of different countries, the mantra of don't make us choose? How should we respond to that hope that, it's a buzz phrase at this point? I just leave that open. I have my own opinions, but I'm not going to take time by sharing them. And the other thing is just a sort of a wild, way out in left field kind of notion. If we spend so much time on the South China Sea, and if India is important, although frustrating in some ways, is it time for the United States to develop a Bay of Bengal policy, which would involve SARC conceivably? I mean, that could be a huge mess. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Or should we simply ignore it? And Kyokpyu, of course, is obviously one of the motivating forces here, insofar as that would facilitate, if you will, China's access through the Indian Ocean. I mean, we talk about the Indo-Pacific, but where's the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, I guess, would be the larger question. If either of you want to comment on those things, that's fine. Feel free to ignore them entirely and raise completely different points in the time remaining. We have about another 7 minutes. Either one. Well, let's go to Scott.
The latter point on the Bay of Bengal, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I have anything particularly useful to say on it. It's just not something I've studied. Obviously, I'm very familiar with Chaopyu, but the broader Bay of Bengal issues I haven't really looked at and don't feel very confident to offer some opinion based on nothing. On the "don't make us choose" mantra, I mean, the reality is, they're not going to choose. It's not particularly useful to be asking them to. I don't think we have been generally, although sometimes they perceive it that way. It goes to me, my point is China's going to be there. They have to have good relations with China, or at least reasonable relations with China. That's a given. To me, our strategic interest there is doing what we can to give them maximum maneuvering room. Not to be aligned with us. I mean, if they choose to align with us, great, but that's not really the goal. The goal is for them to be truly free and independent. And we can best do that by having good relations with them ourselves, good partnerships with them that get into all these areas, and not make it, about China. It should be about the positive agenda with Southeast Asia. And to me, that's the best strategic play for us. And then, hopefully that lessens the need for people in Southeast Asia to keep saying, don't make us choose, because we're clearly not.
Good. Catherine?
Okay, 3 responses. One is, I think the "don't make us choose" mantra is going to fade, because with its new administration, I think the response from the Biden administration to "don't make us choose" is, okay, now what do you want to talk about? Because there was a real concerted effort in the Trump administration, particularly under former Secretary of State Pompeo, to really, ride those divisions between the United States and China. And the rhetorical war was really, quite over the top in many points, but that's going to fade, I think, in a lot of ways. However, you don't have to choose, but if you want to be in our digital trade agreement, if you want to do this or that, you're going to have to meet our standards and demands. So, that's where there's that. But I think that's going to fade away. Let me just say something about international law. Yes, of course, we always want that chapeau, but yes, let's remember that the one who rejected the decision from the UNCLOS was the one who won the case, in many ways, and they have yet to fully embrace their own victory. So I'm not sure how much that means even to Southeast Asian states. But my point is that particularly with the islands that China has militarized, they're never giving those back, no matter what decisions there are. I've asked Vietnamese colleagues why the paracels are still so important to Vietnam when China has had them since the 1970s. And they said, well, for domestic reasons, but we know that they're never giving them back either. What was your third point, your third question? I'm sorry.
Bay of Bengal.
Bay of Bengal. That's a really great question, John, because anybody that hangs out in the US policy community knows how stovepiped the policy community is, and that East Asians and Southeast Asian specialists don't intersect all that often with South Asian specialists. And South Asia policy really, is one that has India at the center, as South Asia has India at the center. There is a lot of discussion in Washington about the Quad. And, whether or not the purpose of the Quad was for the United States to improve its bilateral relationship with India, which is why they were brought into the Quad. But there's more recently been some discussion that perhaps the India is a bit too much of the junior partner in the Quad, because really it's United States, Japan, and Australia that is cooperating in so many things, and all of that. So I think that's a big unsettled question: is what is India's role going to be in the Indo-Pacific? And Southeast Asians know from having 2 decades of India proclaiming that they have a new look East policy, a new look Southeast policy, that India still is very reluctant to get into what we would call entangling alliances, and they will pull their punches. They pulled their punches with RCEP. So I think that maybe they're self-limited there.
Listen, I think it's come time to close the event. It's been extremely interesting to me, and I hope that the audience shares that view. And I'd also thank the audience for the questions that came in. And thank you, Scott, and thank you, Catharin, very much for a very enjoyable and I hope informative, yes, certainly informative from my point of view, session. Appreciate it very much.